It was billed the last best hope for averting climate catastrophe. As world leaders gathered in Glasgow for COP26, the stakes couldn't have been higher.
Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity?
Yet one attempt to actually show pictures of people affected by climate change on billboards ended up being censored. Channel 4 News has learned a climate foundation bought up millions of pounds worth of advertising space at the airports and train stations where tens of thousands of COP delegates would be travelling through. They asked this creative agency to design a campaign. But the adverts they came up with, showing photographs of people directly affected by climate disaster, were deemed unacceptable by Glasgow and Heathrow Airport.
In 20 years of advertising, none of us have ever encountered anything like this.
Advertisers play a role in the climate crisis, with a recent report calculating that the industry is adding 28% to the UK's carbon footprint because of the products they encourage us to buy. This agency has worked with fossil fuel companies in the past, but has since tightened policies around its clients. And for this project, its brief was clear: press home the need for major climate commitments from world leaders.
Sort of messaging which really poses the question to the delegates: what are you going to do? Are you going to let this take place, or are you going to act now with urgency?
It was simply about getting a really impactful message across at the most important time.
We were aware that it could be quite a comfortable experience to kind of go there, and so I think the thing for us was how, you know, these people who don't really have a voice there, how can their experience appear?
The advertising team showed their campaign to the regulator, the Advertising Standards Authority, who found that it was unlikely to contravene their advertising code. But the airports and train stations where the adverts were to be shown rejected the designs. An email seen by Channel 4 News and sent by an intermediate involved in the discussions with Glasgow Airport reads:
"The imagery copy is too shocking for the airport environment, and the passengers need to feel safe. I'm afraid it's a no on the basis of the creative being rather threatening and sinister. It doesn't fit with the airport goal of creating a warm welcome as the first and last impressions that delegates and visitors will have to Glasgow and to COP26.
Despite an agreement with the airport in advance, this was then reneged on, with more than half of the ad space removed, with the airport citing an administrative oversight.
Is that something that's ever happened to you before?
Not to my knowledge. They were so nervous about the scale and the impact of the campaign and the message we were trying to get across. They were willing to give money back to stop that happening.
It wasn't just Glasgow Airport where the ad faced problems. Those involved at Heathrow Airport also resisted the proposed imagery, with an email reading:
"We're comfortable with the images of the people affected by climate change, but images of plagues of locusts and fiery Armageddons will not be accepted."
Meanwhile, an email from discussions about a display at London St Pancras Station said:
"The message feels too political. It feels like it's from Extinction Rebellion, which to most people is not a good thing."
And emails regarding discussions with Network Rail, which controls the space at London Euston and Glasgow Central Station, read:
"This politically motivated campaign is unacceptable to Network Rail. They feel that the copy is still of a campaigning nature and seeking to influence the outcome of the conference."
What do you do at this point then? You've got this feedback, what happens?
Well, we have to get creative. We obviously have to take on board the feedback because they won't run the advertising. So we cropped into the imagery, we tweaked the language to make it softer.
And in one instance, we had to send a selection of crops of people's faces. They wanted to select the faces that they thought people would find least distressing.
They ended up having to crop the photographs so much that the actual impact of climate disaster would no longer be shown. And their slogan, "We're watching you," was also deemed too threatening, so they had to change it to "The world is looking to you."
In multiple locations, we weren't even allowed to use the construct of the gaze and the eyes. They were too sinister. People would feel like they're under surveillance. In some instances, we had to scrap all the photography and literally just have "Welcome to Glasgow."
It really is quite extraordinary that we know on the climate emergency that the big demand from everyone who's working on this to avoid the worst of it is that we have to start by telling the truth. And if we don't tell the truth about the scale of the emergency, we won't rise to it. So if you can't tell the truth about it on the eve of the most important climate summit in world history, then we really are in deep trouble. It's like we've gone back 20 or 30 years to the issue of, does climate change exist? And if you are advocating for a good outcome from the major meeting about climate change, is that somehow overtly political or contentious in some way? I mean, I don't know where these people have been for the last 20 years, but there is an overwhelming consensus that climate change is real, it is caused by people, it is getting much worse, and that this meeting in Glasgow was absolutely critical.
A spokesperson for Glasgow Airport said,
"A campaign, which was agreed by all parties involved, ran on prominent sites across the airport, including the largest advertising site available at the airport. At no point did they share any of the concerns outlined directly with the airport. We worked with numerous organisations, charitable groups and artists to articulate the need for action on climate change to the thousands of delegates and heads of state we welcomed during COP26.
A Heathrow spokesperson said,
The advertising in question ran at the airport throughout COP26, and any suggestion that Heathrow does not recognise the risks of climate change or does not want to engage the aviation industry and public in tackling it is wrong.
Eurostar said,
We have a responsibility to ensure that content is welcoming and does not cause alarm to travellers as they arrive into the country. We were surprised to hear of any concern from the client, as discussions we had were open and collaborative throughout.
And a Network Rail spokesperson said,
As a public body, we have to remain impartial, so all advertising displays inside our stations must meet our code of acceptance. This forbids any advertising which calls for the support of a particular viewpoint.
We've never encountered this level of intervention, and in the context of climate, a general sense that the world is not ready to see the reality of what people are facing.
Adverts are designed to grab our attention, and when companies are trying to sell us products, that's apparently fine. But as for the reality of climate change, it appears that even in the free market world of advertising, that's something off limits.